And it's also the first case, as Mr. Job mentioned, that we have a virtual CSDP mission, so a mission that was planned for but that was never deployed. Although here it's no longer on the Council's website now. So I'm sure you have followed the news in the past months, and you've seen that there was an awful lot of criticism of the EU's reaction to the Arab Spring, but to the Libyan crisis in particular. And the EU has been criticized for reacting too slowly, for being completely divided, and for being essentially incoherent. And some diplomats even went so far as to say that this was the end of CFSP. CFSP died in Bolivia, and we should just look for a sand dune where we can bury it, and that's it. And I will try to answer to what extent the EU was really incoherent in response to the Libyan crisis, and how the EU could improve the coherence in the future. And my talk is based on a paper I published with the Institute of International Affairs in Rome quite some time ago, in July actually. And I will follow three parts. So first of all, I will outline the main parts of the EU's response to the Libyan crisis, and I will focus on the short to medium term response. Then I will analyze the coherence of this crisis response, and finally we'll close with some policy recommendations. And I think they will reflect a little bit what has been said yesterday and also today. So, first of all, the EU's response to the Libyan crisis. So as you know, we've talked about it yesterday, we talked about it today. The EU disposes of a broad range of crisis management instruments, including not only civilian and military missions, but also border management, diplomacy, humanitarian aid, etc. So in response to the Libyan crisis, actually a lot of these instruments came into effect. The first reactions were in the diplomatic field. And there, on 5 days after violence broke out, there were strong condemnations by the High Representative Ashton on behalf of the EU, condemning the violence and urging the Libyan regime to refrain from further violence. Then, at the extraordinary European Council on the 11th of March, the EU went a step further and urged Gaddafi to step down, and welcomed the National Transitional Council and said that this was now a political interlocutor for the EU. In the field of humanitarian aid, the EU from the start of the crisis has been the biggest humanitarian donor, and it has spent until May 145 million euros, which is more or less three times the amount that the United States had spent by then on the Libyan crisis. The EU was also active in the field of border management, because, as you know, there have been migration flows not only from Libya but from North Africa in general, and mostly affecting Italy and Malta. And the EU launched on the 20th of February Operation Frontex Hermes to help the Italian authorities to cope with these migratory flows. In the field of sanctions, the EU has also been rather active. So not only did the EU implement all the sanctions that the UN put forward, but also went beyond them and targeted further entities, further persons, and especially the oil and gas sector. And last but not least, the EU became active in the field of CSDP. It did decide on EUFOR Libya on the 1st of April, which was, as we heard before, a military operation that was to support humanitarian operations on the ground. But also mentioned before, its deployment was made conditional on a call from UN OCHA. And as UN OCHA is generally skeptical of mixing humanitarian and military, this call never came, and EUFOR Libya was never deployed. So what can we see from that? We can see that the EU actually had quite a broad and encompassing response to the Libyan crisis. But the question is, to what extent was this response coherent? And by coherence, I mean, on the one hand, the absence of contradiction between different policies and instruments in the field of crisis management, and on the other hand, which is usually referred to as consistency, and on the other hand, also the existence of mutually reinforcing effects, synergies, etc. between these instruments. And here I will focus on two dimensions of coherence. And the first one is the interinstitutional one, so it's the one between the Commission and Action Service, Commission and the Parliament, etc. And the other one is the one, the vertical side, which is the coherence between the EU level crisis response and the crisis responses of the member states. So first of all, interinstitutional coherence. So it's nothing new that one of the main aims of the Lisbon Treaty and the High Representative and Action Service was to increase coherence of the EU's external action and also to permit it to speak with a single voice. So did the EU speak with a single voice in the Libyan crisis? I would argue it didn't. It spoke with many voices, because if you take the statement of the High Representative condemning the violence, for example, on the 20th of February, this statement was echoed by the President of the Commission, by the President of the Parliament, and by the President of the European Council. And generally you could say, okay, if these statements are compatible and consistent, no problem, because it reinforces the Europeans' voice, the Europeans' message. But the problem occurs in the case when these messages are only slightly inconsistent. And to give you one example, was when apparently in spring Herman van Rompuy made it clear that the goal of intervention in Libya was regime change, while this was then denied in later statements by Lady Ashton. So who do you listen? What is the EU's position? So this is the famous phone number problem once again. Then speaking about interinstitutional tensions, mainly around the Action Service, and we've spoken about that today and yesterday. There are these tensions between the Commission and the Action Service. And to give you the example of humanitarian aid, as you know, humanitarian aid remains in the Commission and is in the responsibility of DG ECHO. And on the other hand, you have now the Department of Crisis Response under Miozzo, who is supposed to give the strategic directive, strategic guidance. But when I spoke with a person from the Commission, they said that Miozzo actually had a very difficult position, because this department was created, but Miozzo didn't have a lot of staff, so he had to rely on the Commission. But from the Commission, there was a kind of bureaucratic resistance, because it didn't want to be coordinated by this new department. And the person I interviewed from the Commission told me, well, in the end, this Department for Crisis Response was something like an empty shell. And this didn't really maybe affect the effectiveness of humanitarian aid delivery in this case, but it shows this general problem, and Simon Duke has mentioned it yesterday, that you have on the one hand the financial instruments still in the Commission, and the strategic guidance that is supposed to come from the Action Service. And this, in a way, creates a need for coordination, but also may create interinstitutional tensions and turf battles. Furthermore, there were also some tensions between the Council Secretariat and the External Action Service. The External Action Service has been seen by the Council Secretariat from the start as a Commission-dominated institution, where procedure overrules strategy, where you need 5 to 10 signatures for every move, and where the crisis management structures are marginalized. And one effect of this perception was that people that were working in the crisis management structures within the Council Secretariat moved to another department within the Council Secretariat before the crisis management structures were transferred. And the result of this was that in the Action Service there was a certain lack of crisis management expertise. And finally, the European Parliament has been one of the strongest critics of the External Action Service and of the High Representative in the Arab Spring and Libyan crisis in particular. And the Parliament tried to push the High Representative towards a more proactive stance. One example was the case of the recognition of the National Transitional Council, where the Parliament really tried to push Ashton. But to the public, or for the outside perception, this criticism, constant criticism of the Parliament, was somehow reinforcing the idea that the EU was weak, too late, incoherent, etc. So passing on to vertical coherence, once again, the first diplomatic reactions. So on the 20th of February, Ashton condemned violence on behalf of the EU. And on the very same day, you had Berlusconi telling the press that he did not want to disturb his friend in Libya. And regardless of the fact of the reasons for this cautious approach, as the foreign ministry in Italy called it, this was not in line with the European diplomatic position, and therefore deprived it of credibility. The other episode that was subject to incoherence was the approach to the National Transitional Council, and once again on the 10th of March, one day before the extraordinary European Council, France rushed ahead and recognized the Transitional Council as the sole legitimate representative of the Libyan people. And the other member states were not really pleased by this move, because they said that this would prevented a common strategy towards the Transitional Council. And when I asked a French diplomat why France rushed ahead, he told me that this was la diplomatie électrochoc, that aimed at pushing the other member states to position themselves on the question. But in fact, it didn't really work out, because the next day at the council meeting, the Transitional Council was only recognized as a political interlocutor, and what followed was an uncoordinated approach of the member states, with some member states recognizing it in May, others in June, and some others even in September. Passing on to the border measures, this was also subject to divisions of the member states, and Italy, which was most affected by the migration flows, was asking for more solidarity and burden sharing from the other member states from the start, really. Whereas the other member states, and particularly Germany and France, held that Italy should be able to handle this problem on its own. And the reaction of Italy was in April to hand out these residency permits to the migrants, because it very well knew that their final destination was rather France than Italy. And this, of course, created some anger in the Justice and Home Affairs Council, where on the one hand, the member states like France and Germany, but also others, threatened to reinstore border controls, and on the other hand, you had former Interior Minister Maroni saying, well, this is the case, if this is Europe, I don't see why we should remain in Europe. And the divisions in this field peaked in April, when France finally closed the border station in Ventimiglia to prevent these migrants from coming up north. And, well, shortly after, these differences, especially between Italy and France, were sorted out bilaterally. But we still have the situation now that the member states are divided on a possible Schengen reform and on this possibility to reinstore border controls. And meanwhile, they forget the maybe more important question, which would be how solidarity in migration management should look like in the future. And to pass to the maybe most visible part of EU incoherence in the case of the Libyan crisis was, of course, the question of military crisis management. So you had, on the one hand, France and the UK that were among the drafters of Resolution 1973, and on the other hand, you had Germany abstaining on the vote in this resolution. So the European partners were rather disappointed or surprised. And apparently, this also slowed down crisis management efforts within the EU. But it's important also to remember that Germany was not the only member state that was skeptical of a European crisis management mission in Libya. There were also others, like, for example, Ireland, the Scandinavians were skeptical, the UK preferred the NATO framework. So the only two nations that were really interested in a CSDP mission were Italy and France. And what happened then, after very difficult negotiations, they came toward France and Italy, from interviews, labeled a kind of minimum consensus, which was EU for Libya. But even when we came to this minimum consensus, the design of EU for Libya was still disputed. So the planning started, but it was blocked already in mid-April by Sweden, which was very skeptical of this blurring of military and humanitarian lines, and this was especially sensitive for Sweden because it was the framework nation of the Nordic battle group whose deployment was considered in the framework of EUFOR Libya. So, what can we conclude the EU in the Libyan crisis? First of all, I think it's fair to say that the EU was not generally weak, slow and incoherent as it might sometimes sound from the media. The EU had a strong sanctions regime despite strong economic interest of European member states, and it was also quick and substantial in its delivery of humanitarian aid. But, especially in public perception, these kind of strong points of the EU's response got overshadowed by the divisions in other policy fields, as I mentioned before. And for the institutional side, it also seems that the High Representative in the Action Service did not, and maybe did not yet, really contribute to much coherence. So I will also close with some policy recommendations, and as I said, they reflect what you said and what you said in the morning maybe as well. So the question is, what can we conclude from the Libyan crisis? And I think it's important to keep in mind what Ashton said at some point, which is that the problem is the reality of 27th and 28th member states who are sovereign, who believe passionately in their own right to determine what they do, and particularly in the area of defense. And in light of this reality, I propose 3 ways forward. The first one is that the EU should increase its leadership for coherence, and this is especially, I think the priority would be to bring together the Commission and the Action Service. And there are 2 ways that I could see this happening. On the one hand, the High Representative has been said to be rather absent from the Commission, and we've heard that before. I think she would have to increase her coordinating role in the Commission, and maybe by convening regular meetings of the Group of External Relations Commissioners, which would contribute to horizontal coherence as well. And on the other hand, bottom up, from the ground. So one example would be the new EU delegation in Tripoli, together with the EU Special Representative for the Southern Mediterranean, and they should try to ensure the coordination on the ground between the different missions of the member states, which might then maybe lead to a kind of bottom-up coherence approach. Secondly, I think the EU should work on Europeanizing responses in the medium term, and one example of how this could work was the approach to the National Transitional Council, because even though the member states were divided and had different approaches, the High Representative still managed to open an office of the EEAS in May, which was seen as something like a de facto recognition of the National Transitional Council. And I think this shows that there is some room for maneuver despite member state divisions. And secondly, in this field, even if member states are divided on military efforts, military missions, which is often the case and might often be the case in the future, the High Representative in the Action Service should make early planning efforts in the field of the less controversial civilian crisis management, and prepare the ground for consensus at an early stage. And one example in Libya where I think this happened was the preparation of efforts in the field of security sector reform. And finally, the EU should work on preventing incoherence in the longer term, because as the Libyan crisis has shown, the divisions between the member states rely on different understandings of terms like solidarity and burden sharing, but also on different views and different strategic cultures regarding broader security issues. So on the one hand, the EU should clarify the meaning of solidarity and burden sharing in the field of migration management, because this was certainly not the last crisis that will affect the EU in terms of migration flows and unequally affect the EU. And I think there is a need for clear thresholds and also for a more precise definition of what is meant by practical solidarity. And on the other hand, I think it's important to relaunch this kind of high-level strategic dialogue on broader security issues, like the role of the future of the CSDP, the role and the use of the battle groups, the conditions for the use of force, capability development, and the list goes on. And I think that the insights could feed into a new European security strategy in the medium term. You mentioned that maybe it should not review its strategy every 6 months, but maybe after 10 years could be an idea. And I found it interesting in the European Council meeting last week that the High Representative was, in some cases, given the explicit task to take forward CSDP. But of course, on the other hand, the High Representative cannot do it on her own, so she needs some groups of member states that stand behind her. And I think the Weimar Triangle, together maybe with Italy and Spain, could play a motor role in this. And finally, to conclude, also in the conclusions on CSDP of the European Council of last week, the Council has noted that there is a growing demand for a more coherent, more capable and more strategic EU. And I think that if the EU wants to be a credible actor on the international stage, it should respond to these demands. And one crucial point will be to learn lessons from Libya. And finally, to quote Javier Solana from 2009, he said, "It is as simple as this: either Europe works together or it becomes strategically irrelevant."